your support for the Untold Radio Network family of shows and join in on the conversation by using super stickers and super chats on YouTube. Got a question you want answered? Ask it live via a super chat and get real-time responses from our show's knowledgeable hosts and guests. Help keep the Untold Radio Network shows running strong. We need your support. Send your super chats and stickers now.
Never believe fully in anybody. Never believe fully in anybody else's BS. I don't care if it's Roger Nish, the Pope, L. Ron Hubbard, Al Gore, George Bush, or I don't care who it is. Don't swallow all their belief system totally. Don't accept all of their bullshit, all their BS. The second rule is like unto the first. Don't believe totally in your own BS. Which means that, as Bucky Fuller said, the universe consists of non-simultaneously apprehended events. Non-simultaneously. The universe consists of non-simultaneously apprehended events, which means any belief system or reality tunnel you've got right now is going to have to be revised and updated as you continue to apprehend new events later in time, not simultaneously. This is the natural functioning of the human brain. It's the way children's brains perform before they're wrecked by the school system. It's the way the minds of all great scientists and artists work. But once you have a belief system, everything that comes in either gets ignored if it doesn't fit the belief system, or it gets distorted enough so that it can fit into the belief system. You got to be continually revising your map of the world.
Welcome to episode 118 of Down South Anomalies. My name's Jay Katz.
And I'm Aspasia.
And you're on the Untold Radio Network. We're going into complete covert mode here at 118. This is David Thrussell is back again.
Yes, he is.
I better get out of the covert
mode.
I can't see a frigging thing. David Thrussell is back, and the title of this episode is JFK and the Fall of Empires.
Yep.
Just coming back off what we're led to believe is the final document dump for eternity of all the documents that were classified pertaining to the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
Okay.
And we're also going to...
So are we going to be able to ascertain what? Oh, we'll see.
We'll see. And we're also going to talk about...
ascertaining as we keep moving along, shall we?
Yeah. Thank you, David.
I'm always ready to ascertain.
Yeah. And we're also going to look into a fascinating book that David drew my attention to recently called The Fate of Empires. And we know what the fate of all empires are. It's the fall of all empires. That's why we've called it the fall of all empires. And that's what it feels like we're in now. It's the most incredible moment of zeitgeist you could imagine.
Are we free falling or what?
We are free falling.
Or are we trying to grab onto?
But we're also in a different piece of land. We're on
the Durrag land at the moment. Yeah,
that's right. So we want to pay our respects to
our elders,
past, present, and emerging. It's amazing how recently our member of the opposition said that we're going to get rid of that, the welcome to country.
The acknowledgement.
It is destroying the Australian economy,
it's
evidently.
Really,
it's pulling the economy down. You know, just a simple...
Well, I think if we get rid of the acknowledgement, it'll fix everything, won't it?
Yeah, you know, let's just forget about the fact that thousands of years of history before white settlers came and stole everything, claimed it was genocide, terra nullius.
They've done that everywhere.
We'll just get rid of that and, you know, just get rid of that sort of nice, you know, acknowledgement of that, and we'll be all fine.
We will.
At the end of the day. What is happening with the world?
I have a suggestion, actually, about all of these politicians, because I'm actually not a fan of any of them, to be straightforward with you.
Really? My brother-in-law that lives out here was a politician.
Yeah, your brother-in-law, of course.
Thank you.
Yeah, naturally.
Well, he's not anymore, so that's okay.
Yeah. Well, that's right. So I did make an exception, but I'm not making it anymore. But no, look, my position on I think they're all puppets, and I think they're all liars, and I don't think we should actually respect them enough to give them names. I've started just referring to them as puppet 327/B, you know, is currently versus puppet 491. You know, I'm not addressing them by name anymore because, you know.
Look, here's the thing.
People,
we know
you know.
We know politicians, they will say and do say whatever they need to get into power. That's the way it works. If you come on and start saying things that people don't want to hear, no one's going to vote for you. All right? That's just the way it works. So you've got to tell people what they want to hear, what they want you to do. And then when you get
I think it's like used car salesman, you know? I mean, a used
Yeah.
car salesman,
Yeah.
he's going to tell you anything about that bomb, you know?
Absolutely.
Like, oh, no, he went to church on Sundays. And blah, blah, blah. You know, I mean, why are we paying attention?
Because that's the way, that's the system we have. That's why.
Because
that's why.
it's been
No, but
sold
I'm
to
out. I'm checked out. I'm officially checked out.
It's been sold to us as authority, and
Yeah,
you know,
and
very few
anyway.
people survive speaking truth to power.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
I absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We
I
have
should.
just lost the
Yes.
astounding Virginia Giuffre.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
And her father is questioning that at the moment. Her whole history was one of abuse, even, I believe, in her family circle there. That's why she ended up homeless. I mean, really, to begin with, who employs 15-year-olds as massage therapists?
Pedophiles.
But no, let's not go any further with this before we cut off YouTube, Asper said. I told you to mind your words at the beginning.
You asked me a question, I've answered
Listen,
it.
can we introduce David? David Thrussell
Yes.
is an astounding independent musician
Yes.
with an incredible history of his music being an exorcist that talks truth to power, and in such a funky, fantastic, unbelievable way. It is astounding. Not just the band Snog, but the solo act Black Lung.
Black Lung.
This man has not stopped. He has actually scored many Australian films and bits of TV series.
Yep.
He is a writer, an author, a world traveller.
Yes.
He is a non-stop researcher. He runs an amazing record label. Can we pop that up?
Yeah.
The Ballad of JFK. Just tell us a little bit about this label if people need to search out these incredible lost pieces of history that you find the master tape for, remaster and get back out to the world in vinyl and on CD, David.
Look, sure. So, yeah, that album is one product from the Omni Recording Corporation. That's a label that we run. It started many years ago, actually. I was scoring a film, and the film, I think, you know, I was just a composer. I wasn't involved in any of this stuff, but I think Sony Music had put in $1 million or $2 million or something rather like this into the budget of the film. And so there was these people hanging around from Sony Music International. And when, you know what it's like, you're working on one of these things, and at that precise moment, everybody wants to be your best friend, you know? So I'm talking to the head of Sony International, who wasn't a bad guy, you know? I mean, you know, he was
They're
all
breathing, you cut, they bleed.
Yeah.
He's a person.
And anyway, it was, you know, he was keen to, in that precise moment, to be the best mate I'd ever had. So he was like, "Oh, mate, you're such a great guy. I'll do anything for you. Anything, you name it, anything I can do." And I said, "Well, actually, yes, there is something you can do. You can get me access to all these incredible master tapes that are locked up in your Sony vaults that you don't even know you have, because they, you know, possess hundreds of thousands of them. You can grant me access to them. I mean, I'll pay for the privilege, but just, you know, the world, in my view, needs to hear some of these sort of unknown gems. And, you know, if you want to help me out and get me, because they were notorious, the major labels were and are notorious for just denying access to all this stuff that they have zero interest in re-releasing themselves, but they also have zero interest in anyone else having anything to do with it either. So it simply remains unheard, which I think is the death of music, you know, is my very simple position, is if music is not heard, then it's dead.
It doesn't exist.
Yeah, it doesn't exist. That's right. So I said to this fellow, he wasn't a bad guy, and I said to him, "All right, well, you can get me into your vaults, you know, into your Sony vaults in Nashville and New York." And he said, "Oh, mate, anything for you, blah, 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 all this stuff." I said, "All right, great." So I sort of perennially kept hassling him, and I got his home phone number, so I would ring him every night at dinner time at home and go, "How are we going? How are we going with those master tapes?" He's, "Oh, mate, anything for you. Anyway, this went on for a long time, as you can imagine. and I'd kind of given up. And then literally a year and a half later, this big box arrives at my post office box in the countryside. You know, we live in the countryside, as you know, and there's this big box at the local post office. And I'm like, oh, what's this? I don't know what this is going to be. And I open it up, and I see something that says blah, blah Studios Nashville, right? And it was like Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know. There were beams of sunlight exploding out of the box as I tore it open, right? And it was these master tapes actually for this one of the first records we did, which was a Henson Cargill record. It was a great country singer who I'm very fond of.
So had you asked him for what you wanted?
Oh yeah, I had a list.
Yeah,
I had a list.
Okay,
you know,
so he sent you, but it took a year and a half.
Oh yeah, no, and that was with his home phone number. So good luck to anybody else, you know. So anyway, that's how it began, you know, and it was quite fortuitous, you know. I mean, I think it was definitely fortuitous because through, you know, my point is through the sort of random happenstance of me happening to be scoring this film and these people happening to be involved and blah, 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 all that stuff, I was able fortuitously to obtain access to some of that stuff that otherwise, you know, forget it. It's not going to happen.
Never would have seen the light again.
Never would have seen the light ever again, you know. Yeah. So that's how things began anyway. Yeah.
And how many releases have you done on the Omni recording label?
Well, I couldn't tell you exactly, but it's over 100. It's probably getting up towards 150, I guess.
Right.
You know?
That is remarkable.
We've done a lot of stuff, and I feel honestly, because I'm pretty sure that no one from Sony is watching, I'm going to tell you,
I hope not.
very, very gladly that it's really felt like a sort of, you know, you know, a liberation exercise. It's felt like a guerrilla exercise where we can run around in their vault and their little robot machines that pull out, because, you know, they have, you know, hundreds of thousands of master tapes, maybe millions. I have no idea, but a lot. And, you know, they have, I know in the New York Sony Vault, they have like these robots that go around and pull out master tapes according to their numbering system, right? So it feels like we've done a completely sort of guerrilla liberation operation and prized open the vault doors and liberated as much great music as we could get our hands on, basically.
That's an incredible achievement. And look, just pointing to this particular album, we'll put a link to the a website we've got where people can purchase this material. This is a whole series of singles that dissented.
Anything that was sung, written, any songs, any tunes that were written about JFK at the time of his assassination, is that correct?
No,
or just
I have to get a bit detailed about that. That's actually not true. No, It's actually a highly curated selection because there are hundreds of songs published. And I limited it just to the 1960s. So it's from 1963 until 1969. And
so just, when he was murdered.
Hundreds of songs about the Kennedy assassination. And I went through and essentially picked my favorites, really, you know. So the earliest song that we have on there is from Red River Dave. And as far as I can discern from the matrix numbers and a few other things, that was pressed about a couple of days to a week after the assassination.
Wow.
That the Red River Dave tribute to the slain president was released, let's say, a week after the assassination. And so what Red River Dave would do, because I'm a Red River Dave fan, he would press up these records independently, privately at the local pressing plant, often at that time it was in San Antonio in Texas where he lived. And he'd press up 100 or 200 or whatever the smallest amount he could get away with. And he would drive around town spruiking them to people out of the boot of his car. And he would be selling them to people, you know, for 25 cents or 35 cents or whatever it was, 50 cents maybe, out of the boot of his car, you know. So records like that, because I know some of the background story, I spoke in detail to his widow. I know, roughly how that sort of situation worked. Some of those records are extremely rare. Like you,
they would be. What are they worth now? Do you know?
And I'm a Red River Dave aficionado, and there are rumored Red River Dave 45s that I've never seen or heard of a copy of listing. And
you're talking about hundreds of millions of people versus 200 copies.
Yeah.
It's just astounding that you're able to find any of that material in this day and age. But you were the person that went down to Oak Cliff into top 10 records there and managed to score a bit of a back catalogue before that shop shut down and speak to first-hand eyewitnesses that the FBI had never spoken to at the time of Kennedy's assassination. Now, one thing I do have to say about David is he is one of Australia's leading JFK researchers.
Mm-hmm.
Now, recently, can you give us any insight, any light on your perspective of this incredible data dump? Is it every classified document is now unclassified? Can that be true?
Okay, so I have two basic positions on this, okay? And I do think it's really important to always stay pretty firmly in touch with reality, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So I think firstly, of course I'm interested, but firstly, the idea that CIA, the FBI, Pentagon, whoever, any federal agency that's affected by this executive order, the idea that any of those agencies are going to keep documentation for 60 years that might be permanently embarrassing to them or compromising to them or people that they're closely associated with, I think is a little bit hopelessly naive. Okay. So first thing out of the gate, I never personally expected any great bombshells to come out of this. And you've also got to remember, in addition to that, I mean, basically the first rule of spycraft is don't write it down, dickhead. You know, like, I mean, seriously, this is basic spycraft. You know, if you're about to, let's hypothesize, if you're about to assassinate, Lady Di, you don't put it in a memo. You know, you don't get Mabel at reception to type up the memo saying, next Friday afternoon, we're going to blow the president's head off. Okay. It doesn't happen that way. All right. So the idea that there's going to be anything,
earth-shattering
in there, I think is a little hopelessly naive. And that's coming from someone who admits that he is a little hopelessly naive. So it's probably even more naive than that, I mean, the second thing is, of course, in my view, the conspirators, okay, and let's, move past all the obvious stuff, the conspirators who it would appear, because the cover-up still continues, I would argue, in the Kennedy assassination, there must be a reason for that cover-up to continue, okay? And, of course, we could discuss what possible reasons might be. But because the cover-up continues, there must be a reason, okay? And there are some obvious possibilities there, and that is that institutions or individuals who have some stake in that scenario are still around or still have power in some fashion, So if that's the case, if I was in their shoes, and I'm not, but if I was in their shoes, what I would do is I would sprinkle some files with a few little bits of here and there that might be quite interesting to people down the rabbit hole, but nothing that's going to make me lose my job. That's what I would do. So of course I have followed it. I'm not going to deny that I have followed it. There are some things in there which I personally find very interesting, but I think the idea that, it's going to bring the temple down is a little optimistic.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to get into the shoes of Alan Spector today, the man who came up with the miraculous magic bullet theory, and is still out there. His shoes. I mean, none of us, not even Alan Spector, should be able to fit into his shoes by now, and they must be very uncomfortable shoes to be in. But I think that
can I look? Stop me if you must, right? But I really want to mention this book. I don't know that I've mentioned it to you guys before. Hang on, can I get it. Oh, there you go. You can see it.
Yeah.
False Mystery, right? By
Right.
Vincent Salandria, right? I don't know if you're aware of this book. It's really it's close to my favorite Kennedy assassination book, and I think it's one of the most important. It's very rare. It's very hard to find. Vincent Salandria was a Philadelphia lawyer. We lost him, unfortunately, a year or two ago, but he was one of the first people to really publicly call out the Warren Commission. So he was no fool, but he argues in that book that we need to move beyond all the rabbit holes, and we need to stop trying to figure, as tempting as it is, trying to figure out all the details of how this murder was accomplished. Okay. And, of course, we all love a whodunit. I like Sherlock Holmes. Okay, sure. I get it. It's tempting to disappear down these rabbit holes, and I've been down them. Don't worry, but he argues that the far more important question is why? Why did this happen? Okay, so maybe we should be pulling back from all these details. And it's interesting that they're still, over 60 years later, they're still throwing us rabbit holes to run down. Okay, so that we don't, I would suggest, so that we don't look at the more concrete things of like, why did this happen?
Yeah.
Which gives the perpetrators time to actually sort of smooth over everything with a great campaign of continuous bombardment of disinformation. When you find that
But you know what? Here's the thing. It's like, every time somebody says, or a new president is elected, they always say, I'm going to bring out all the JFK files and I'm going to find out the truth about UFOs. That's been every single president, right? They say it every time. And they go in there and they say, now I want all the information that is available now on these two subjects. Now, unless that president actually goes down into the vaults personally himself, how does he know that they're giving him everything that's down there? They could just bring out a whole bunch of things, say, okay, this is what we've got. And you've got to take it at face value, because they're not going to let anybody else without a top secret clearance go down there. So you have to take their word that they're giving you everything that they've got.
Of course. But I mean, my argument is, you're right. Of course you're right. But my argument is, what makes you think that they would keep those things?
Well, that's right. That's the other thing too. It's like they could have burnt everything. They could have burned everything and said there's nothing. Sure. Well, they could say there's nothing. It's all gone and they're all down there.
I mean,
we don't know.
Pop culture has given us some incredible clues, and there in the early 60s, I know there was a very popular TV series produced by Mel Brooks and our other gentleman that alluded to the machinations Get Smart. And in that, if anything was written down, which it wasn't, they had the cone of silence. One of the agents had to eat the paper once he'd given the instructions. So, and it was there. And you know what? At that stage, the CIA and the FBI got really upset with the production company.
What was his name?
Buck Henry.
Buck Henry. So Buck Henry and Mel Brooks came up with Get Smart. And so many of those, ridiculous, systems that they had in Get Smart were actually real. And the CIA going, how are these people working out our stuff? It's like, because they're just being ludicrous. They're just being so over the top that's exactly what you people are doing.
But you're right. I mean, none of this stuff is going to be ever classified and placed into the hands of the public.
Of course not.
It seems highly unlikely, But I mean, that said, I mean, the source that I follow the most about this stuff is the journalist Jefferson Morley, the guy who wrote the book The Ghost about James Jesus Angleton, and he compiled a list which I thought was very interesting. This sort of wish list of files that they know exist because they're referenced elsewhere. And he's been going through that list and denoting how many of the files on that supposed wish list have been released so far, and it's about half of them. So there's a bunch of stuff that even with a presidential executive order, and I find this interesting, even with a presidential executive order, which is now law, he has said that the CIA in particular, probably also the FBI as well, you would imagine, and other agencies you would imagine as well, they are flagrantly disobeying that law and holding on to all sorts of files. And, you know, you can have a good stab in the dark as to why that may be the case. I mean, there are interesting things in there. I mean, I think for me, one of the most interesting is that James Angleton, a leading figure at the CIA in the 1960s, obviously, had their 180-page file, their internal file on Lee Oswald. Don't forget this guy who was a loner and a loser, that nobody cared about or knew about. They had a 180-page internal file, and it was on James Angleton's desk the week before the Kennedy assassination.
Right.
They can track it, the routing numbers on there, so they can determine who saw that file. And so it was on Angleton's desk the week before the Kennedy assassination, which I think,
says something.
Yeah, I think that tells you something,
And Jim D'Ingenio and Oliver Stone have come out stating that there are numerous memos that have been now placed into the public's hand during this document that show that Hoover was basically in the same situation. He was getting memos literally on a daily basis about Oswald for 2 years prior to the assassination. So what's going on there? I mean, my wife and I have always had a problem with someone who defects to Russia and then is brought back in without any trouble whatsoever.
And not had he been shot for treason. That's what he should have. At the height, at that time that he defected to Russia, it was like Reds under the bed scare. Everybody was hypersensitive about the communists. And this guy goes to Russia, comes back married to a KGB, one of the heads of KGB's nieces, and he's allowed back into the country, and he and his wife weren't thrown into jail and shot. Do you know what I mean?
That's romance.
That's what should have happened.
That's the power of romance. That's the international power of love right there, okay? They saw that. James Angleton saw that in the file, and he thought, what the hell?
Young love.
These two are in love. Our spy and their spy, they're in love. Let's leave them alone, guys. In fact, let's give them some traveler's aid money and whisk them out and send them on their way.
And so send them off to what's her name? What was her name?
Ruth Payne.
Ruth Payne's house. Let Ruth look up. Oh, Ruth look after him.
They used to call her Straight Arrow Ruth. There's nothing funny going on with Ruth Payne.
No, nothing
whatsoever.
at all.
So I have a record. I've got a record. It might even be a double LP on Folkways. It's Marguerite Oswald, so Lee Oswald's mum, reading his letters from Russia, right? No, it is. It's a record on Folkways. I have it. So
what a great label that was, Folkways. Extraordinary. So ethnographic.
All sorts of stuff. Yeah, they also did the double LP of poetry about the Kennedy assassination, which I have as well. But on this record of Marguerite Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald's mum, she explicitly says on the record, literally on the record, she says it out loud, I believe that my son was an intelligence agent of the US government.
Absolutely he was. Absolutely he was.
Yeah.
There's no way he would have been able to do what he did if he wasn't.
Now, if you've ever done a FOIA release for the, through the archives, you can find that unless you've got it down to the specific second or minute, you're not going to get the document you want. They can say it's not there because you haven't got it timed properly. But if you do land on it, you're going to get this sort of trouble, which is redaction. So I mean, you might get the pages, you won't be able to see
the information
what is on the frigging pages.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
And it begs the question 60 years later, over 60 years later, well, why? And I mean, I look, the details are fascinating. Okay, we've all been down these rabbit holes, but I think there is also a bigger picture about the Kennedy assassination that I think we rarely discuss. And I think that is a mistake to rarely discuss it. And it's a point that I want to raise. And I'm sure other people have raised this point, but I haven't heard them raise it. Okay. But I feel like it's invisible in plain sight. It's right in your face. It's so in your face that we don't ever discuss it. And that is, I mean, if you zoom out, politics and power. Okay. So in politics and power, there's often conflict, of course. It's been there since the beginning of time. Okay. And it's often the case that one powerful person or group of powerful people decides to remove another person who is an obstacle to their power or to their aims or their goals. Okay. There's nothing, historically speaking, there's
nothing new.
Nothing unusual about that whatsoever. Okay?
Caesar.
Yeah, of course. Caesar, take your pick, you know. Yeah. But what's unusual about the John F. Kennedy assassination, I would argue, right, because they could have got rid of the guy. They could have poisoned him. They could have cooked up some sex scandal. That wouldn't have been hard. Some sort of media smear, you know. Sure. They could have just got rid of him at the next election somehow. There's a lot of ways to remove your enemies in the political sphere, okay? And they've all been used many, many, many times, okay? So why go to the risk, because it's a risky thing to do, to blow off the US president's head in a motorcade in a public place
in front of everybody,
with hundreds of people, members of the public, physically present, but also the world watching via the media? That's a dangerous thing to do, okay? And it takes a lot of, you know, forget Lee Oswald, you know, he failed the paraffin test, okay? He hadn't fired a gun that day, okay? So let's just put Oswald out of the picture for the moment. Whoever organized that thing and executed that execution had access to incredible resources. Okay?
Well, you got to stop right there. This is where you go. Whoever had, it was at the highest levels of government, right? It wasn't the mafia, because the mafia does not have the power to shut down, to tell police and police departments what to do or what not to do, which was happening. The hospital, who was in charge of doing the autopsy, who was in the autopsy room, all of that stuff was orchestrated from the top. It was at the highest level of the American government, or even, you know, the secret government, if you can say. No one else. It wasn't the Russians. It wasn't the Cubans. It wasn't the mafia. It wasn't any person that they threw up. It was American politicians or American, you know, Secret Service, NSA, CIA, FBI. That's who orchestrated that. It can't have been anybody else. Anybody else does not make any sense.
Let David finish his line of
I'm
talking.
just saying it. It's like that shuts all that shit down.
Yeah,
I agree.
Done. I'm sorry, done.
Is it might possibly go even further than that, you know?
Well,
and what I would suggest is what we're seeing there. If you really pull back and try and have a sort of calm, sober look at the whole situation, as you say, and you're absolutely right, you see incredible power on display. You see incredible resources on display. And I do think one level of that operation is psychological warfare. Okay. And I think psychological warfare on a couple of fronts, okay, not just one front, but a couple of fronts. I think on one obvious front, it's a signal of power. We can blow this guy's head off in front of the world, and there's nothing you can do about it. Exactly. Don't mess with us, okay?
So we'll blow yours off.
Well, it's the killing of the king, isn't it? The killing of the king.
I've had this conversation so many times. So many times people have said to me, I've heard this so many times. People have said to me, well, if they can blow the president's head off, imagine what they can do to me, okay?
Well, exactly.
So this is incredibly demoralizing to the public, okay? Because, you know, the polls tell us, for what polls are worth, the polls tell us that 80% of the public have always questioned the Warren Commission and the lone assassin hypothesis. So most people outside of the mainstream media and mainstream politics, most people have a lot of questions about the Kennedy assassination. They just don't have anywhere to voice those questions generally, you know. So it's a great way of traumatizing and demoralizing.
And they did.
Yeah, and they did, right?
They did.
And frightened people psychologically, it's well established that frightened people are obedient. Okay,
Yes.
they'll do what they're told.
Yeah.
Because they're frightened, But it's also a great way to send a signal to political rivals or other people who in positions of power who might go, hang on a second, what's going on here? They see that. They see that raw, naked expression of power on display in Philly Plaza, and they go, oh, I'm going to shut up. Like the Kennedy family. The Kennedy family sees that, goes, I'm not saying anything, because if they can do that, I'm toast,
Well,
so
Robert Kennedy, his brother, was the Attorney General. He was the guy who could bring any kind of investigation, right, into that, and he didn't. He did nothing about it.
But I think you've got a very important point there. This is psychological warfare. It's Hegelian, and it is the shock and awe.
Yeah.
And, if it didn't work with John F. Kennedy, it certainly worked with Lee Harvey Oswald, which was the first worldwide televised execution anyone had ever seen.
Yeah, on television. Yeah.
And at that point, most people realized, well, you don't really want to speak about this because they are literally getting away with murder.
Yeah.
I think largely speaking, it worked. It traumatized the public. It traumatized people in positions of power who may have had some integrity. And as you point out, you're absolutely right. Robert Kennedy is an excellent example. I mean, we know from the Talbot book and a few other sources, apparently, that Robert Kennedy didn't believe the Warren Commission at all, but he felt that he was not in it. And this is interesting, isn't it? The Attorney General of the USA felt that he was not in a powerful enough position.
That's ridiculous.
Well, but this is really useful information.
Yeah, no, I know.
Really useful information, because it tells you what it tells me is that there are power structures way above these nominal national governments. Okay, way above their pay grade. Okay, so if Robert Kennedy, the ostensible Attorney General of the US at the time, admits privately, this is above my pay grade, I can't do anything about this right now.
There you go.
This tells you, it tells you that there's an obvious structure, and we've just seen it. The magician has just appeared from behind the curtain for a moment. We've seen this structure that is far more powerful than our nominal, I would suggest, somewhat fake national government.
Democracy.
Yeah, well, our democracy is fake, isn't it? It's fake.
Yeah, totally.
Because if they can blow off the guy's head in the middle, in the middle of Dealey Plaza without any consequences, well, the democracy is fake, isn't it? I think that's also part of the message. I think part of the message, because this is clever. They're evil, but they're clever. Part of the message is, you can have your little democracy sandpit thing. You can play with your little democracy toys. Here's your little democracy Tonka truck and your democracy digger and a few other toys, in your sandpit. But when the adults are in the room, you will do what you're told.
And I think it's important for us to highlight, especially for our listeners and viewers in the US, and we're not talking about America, the country, the people. We're talking here about corporatocracy. And 2 weeks ago when we were speaking, we had that coup and I shouldn't use that word, coup, should I? But we got Ross Coulthard on the show. Ross actually said to us that primarily the UFO cover-up is to do with corporations, that it's beyond the government bounds. It's corporations that have got hold of information they can capitalize on. Now, what that information is, we will never know.
Teflon,
and maybe
Velcro.
Well, who knows? It may be none of that stuff. But then
they're not showing us anything else in all that time.
And then he hesitated, but he stated to us, and he has been working with, I don't know if you're aware of his work with these whistleblowers, but he's been working with heavily credentialed people whose lives are being threatened. They're coming out to speak truth to power. He said he believes that the whole space program and the UFO enigma factored into the reasons behind the assassination.
Look, it's possible. I mean, I think, as you point out, we're probably not going to be privy to these sort of details ever. And that's why I choose the path of trying to zoom out as much as possible and trying to learn from what I feel like are the most obvious lessons to be learned from these things. And I think the most obvious lesson for me from the Kennedy assassination is that this is how power actually works.
Yes,
okay?
absolutely.
It's brutal, it's raw, and it's ugly. And we can pretend with all our silly democracy nonsense as much as we like to entertain ourselves. You know, it's like the wrestling. It's just like the wrestling. Oh, he's down on the mat. He's going to lose this time. Oh, no, he's up again, blah, blah, blah. It's just the wrestling, all that day-to-day, party politics.
It's all very scripted.
It is. It's all very fake. But actual power, see, what happened in Dealey Plaza is what actual power looks like, okay? If you get in our way, you're done, buddy, okay? You're done.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, don't worry about your legal system or your notion of democracy. Don't you think it's incredibly, our background, we met as therapists, we went into welfare work, I've done a lot of psych nursing. One thing that struck me was in our hierarchical system in Western culture, we award the winners, the people that get into power. How many of those people, and I'm not just talking about today's administration in the US, I'm talking about historically, how many of those winners, those people, come from extremely dysfunctional backgrounds, abusive backgrounds? And that is where they lose this notion of conscience, if they ever have one, and empathy. They're able to aggressively compete. They take about a Machiavellian role in deceptively manipulating people. They're extremely narcissistic. These are all byproducts of abuse. And it seems that we've awarded the most abused people in our culture to keep repetitively abusing everyone around them, including the proletariat.
Especially. Yeah, look, I understand your point, and I largely agree, actually. When I zoom out of that picture sometimes, really our society looks like I draw the parallel with some sort of cattle ranch. So the cattle ranch is run by psychopaths, people without empathy. Sometimes I wonder if they're actually almost a different species to the rest of humanity, because your average human has empathy and doesn't really want to hurt other people and doesn't want to really, do harm to people, particularly, blah, 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 blah. Except there were those interesting experiments, in the 50s and 60s.
Oh, yeah.
Where they got people to do all sorts of horrible things on the supposed orders of authority, which I think is very, very interesting, okay? So we've taken notice of those kind of psychological experiments. You can be sure that other people have taken even more notice of those kind of experiments. Okay? And so I do think, zooming out, that our society looks like a kind of cattle ranch built and run by psychopaths. And then, I know it's an ugly analogy to use, but I think it's quite accurate. Unfortunately, the rest of the population, including us, are
lambs to the slaughter.
Now, I'm not going to use the name of a certain head of a major space company and car company out there, but recently there was a statement made that empathy is the most destructive and corrosive force that has ever been. Now, empathy is the most important force of all.
Once you lose your empathy,
let's move on. Maybe just give us a description of why you think this book is so important. The Fate of Empires and Search for Survival by John
Sir John
Glubb. Is that how I pronounce his name?
John Bagot Glubb. Yeah. Also known as Glubb Pasha. So he is.
What a great name.
Here's a physical copy of the book. There you go. So John Glubb was a very interesting fellow. He was a professional Englishman, a professional soldier, and he ended up at the end of his the last 20 odd years of his military career, actually. He was the commander of what was then known as the Transjordan Army. So the King Hussein, I guess it was, of Jordan, had appointed him to be the head of the Transjordan Army, the country today known as Jordan. And Bagot was the head of that for over 20 years, I believe. And he was a really interesting fellow, a great thinker, and a great historian. I've got, and I don't have everything by any means, but I've got 10 to 15 of his books here. He wrote a history of the Arabs, He wrote Soldier of Fortune, which was a book about his own life. He wrote a lot of books about Arab history, had a deep appreciation of Arab history, spoke Arabic fluently, and was really quite a fascinating fellow. Near the end of his life, he wrote this book after a big bibliography of really interesting books. If you ever see a book by John Glubb, you should get it. They're always interesting. He also wrote a couple of works of philosophy, and near the end of his life, he wrote this book, The Fate of Empires. It was actually originally, the first part of it, The Fate of Empires, was an article in this Scottish magazine, Blackwood's magazine. This is the issue with The Fate of Empires in it from Christmas 1976. And it struck up at the time. And of course, these things disappear. The internet age actually robs us of a lot of history. But at the time, late 1976, early 1977, I'm just trying to get it so you can see it. His magazine article in Blackwood's caused quite a sensation. And a lot of people wrote letters to him debating what he had said or asking him questions. And he responded with another booklet, which is that second part of this one, when it was published as a book called The Search for Survival. So that's him responding to people's questions about what he had written in The Fate of Empires. And what Glubb wrote in The Fate of Empires, as a really quite a fine historian and a person with a strong grasp on history, especially in the Middle East, and a very sympathetic grasp of history. He was known as a great champion of the Arabic peoples.
So where is he originally from? Where is Glubb from?
He's an Englishman. I'm guessing north of England somewhere, I'd say. Perhaps.
Right, so he's British. Yeah.
So what he proposes in The Fate of Empires is he says, look, our studies of history are completely flawed. We talk about people and we talk about dates, and it's all very kind of useless. Our study of history is really quite useless to us as a society. What we need to do is we need to pull out and study history as a grand canvas, as a large sort of picture, okay? And he does that, and he talks about the history of empires, and he focuses on, obviously, the empires that he readily had information about, so a lot of Middle Eastern ones and European ones largely. And he looks at the history of empires as a whole, and he notices some very interesting things that people had not really noticed before. And that is that empires tend to have a lifespan, okay? And they tend to have a very predictable lifespan, actually. If you look over history, roughly speaking, according to Glubb and his analysis, empires tend to last roughly about 250 years. And he notes that that's roughly, certainly in that time frame, about 10 generations, okay? So he breaks the structure, the arc of an empire or a civilization or even a society. They're all microcosms of the same thing, he argues, that they have an arc that lasts about 10 generations. They begin with great enthusiasm and innovation and conquest and energy. They, if they're successful, they become wealthy. Then they become affluent. Affluence inevitably leads to decadence, and decadence leads to collapse. So that's basically Glubb's arc. Okay, and he lists, in the book, he lists 12 to 15 different empires, the Assyrians, the Persians, all sorts of ones, the Egyptians, the Romans. He breaks it into
the Greeks. Were the Greeks in there? Of course.
Of course
they rose and fell.
And that's where we're at right now. The fall of the Rome.
With the fall of...
and these things are inevitable. What he doesn't explicitly say it, but he kind of infers it. And I think it's a very interesting point, that this arc of empires is really tied very closely to human nature. Okay, so human nature is, if you, and it's interesting because I will connect this to the Unabomber Manifesto as well at one stage, but we'll get there. Okay, human nature is that if if you're, the natural state of humans, I would argue generally throughout history is if you're struggling for your own survival, if you're engaged and, the bulk of your time or all of your time is engaged with providing for your own and your children or your own family or your own group or tribe or society's survival, that's actually a very healthy thing for people. That is very satisfying for people, and it makes them kind of strong and functional. Okay, when you have an excess of resources, okay, and I think as uncomfortable as it may be, we kind of know this is true. When we have an excess of resources, we become flabby and weak. That's my language, not Glob's language.
We start to look at, weird things. We start to delve into things that we probably shouldn't, because we're not out foraging for food and making sure we've got shelter and warmth and all the things that we need to survive every day.
We're spoiled.
We then start to look to fulfilling our blah blah blah
desires, not needs.
Yeah, then we start looking at our desires, and that's where the fall starts.
And
when we have things like the
I agree. And as a species, we lose focus. And it's interesting,
totally,
because if you read the Unabomber Manifesto, which is a fascinating read,
and we're not endorsing it here.
I don't. I sincerely don't endorse murdering innocent people. But the book itself, there's not enough have been said about that book. His manifesto is fascinating, and there's some really clear lines to be drawn between Glove's The Fate of Empires and the Unabomber Manifesto. I'd recommend reading them both, but not engaging in the Unabomber's activities outside of his manifesto. But there's a lot to be learned. Look, let's be broad-minded about this, even with things that you disagree with strongly. And I do personally disagree strongly with killing innocent people. But if you put that aside, there are some really fascinating ideas in there, that should and must be grappled with. Our relationship with technology is very fraught. I personally, it's my personal view that human beings have an innate weakness for technology. I think we allow ourselves to be ruled by technology, and that's a kind of an implicit argument that the Unabomber makes in his manifesto. But nevertheless, what Glove is saying is that there is this very trackable arc, and as you pointed out, we become spoiled, I think was the word you used. So affluence, it kind of robs us of purpose, okay? And like all creatures, because human beings, we're creatures just like any other, we thrive best with purpose, okay?
Yes.
So when we become purposeless, we become sort of, in Glove's analysis, affluence leads to decadence, which inevitably leads to collapse.
Yes.
Okay. And I don't think it's, it shouldn't be controversial to
we see it around us all the time.
That information and apply it in our own situation, I would suggest.
Yeah.
And I think we know that in every cliche that's ever been kicked up about power.
Well, let's throw up some names, corruption. The people that have become, have had, grew up very poor or, underprivileged, and then have gotten money for whatever reason, and then have just lost their minds and become, horrible.
Well, I think the other thing too is
it reminds me of people who win the lotto. You hear all these stories about people who win the lotto and go completely bonkers, And I mean, also, a little while back, I wrote a long and spicy article for New Dawn magazine, which they asked me to do, but then they declined to print it because they felt it was too spicy. But it was called The Golden Age of Caligula. And in that article, I raised the argument that, we all know Caligula as a historical character, fascinating, corrupt, as far as we know, horrific figure, but I raised the argument in that article that now we're living in the golden age of Caligula, because instead of one Caligula, we've probably got 1,000 Caligulas running riot around the planet. and there's no force that appears to want to give them feedback. Maybe that's the most polite thing that I could say. That's a situation that is probably, almost because we have a global empire now. Really, we have this sort of neoliberal capitalist order that sort of embraces the whole planet. Really, I think that's a clear byproduct of affluence and excess of resources that then are channeled into continuingly aberrant behaviors.
Well, I read that when there's been the fall, they did a study on empires, and one of the signs of the collapse, or a couple of the signs, have when an empire is about to collapse is sex and food, and abundance of it, out of control. So when everything is about food and sex, then that's when it's all going to go down here. Meanwhile, in another corner of the planet, people are starving because they can't feed their children a little bowl of rice once a day. You know what I mean? And this is where we're at. We've got corporations throwing. I mean, I just saw a thing on Facebook this morning, this guy pleading people to buy from some farmers, blah, 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 because the supermarkets wouldn't accept this zucchini because it was too small, and this zucchini because it was too big, right? And they just throw them out. They won't purchase them off the farmers to put in their supermarkets because they've all got to be uniform. Now, when we're at that stage, when there's people starving for food in the Western world, we're about to collapse. That's just it's saying it all there. Who cares if it's not the right size? It's food,
But this is the sort of madness that kind of decadence produces, and I would argue that, looking big picture, if you zoom out, our society is looking kind of quite insane, really. And that's, in light of these sort of ideas, that's not that surprising. And it's interesting what you say, because that mirrors what Glove says. Actually, there's a very interesting part in this book where he talks about an obsession with celebrity chefs, pop stars, and celebrities, and he goes, and he talks about this, and he goes, you thought I was talking about today? No, I'm talking about the Persian Empire in 350 BC, just before it collapsed. People became completely obsessed with celebrity chefs and pop singers.
Yes,
and 25 years later, it was all gone.
Well, unfortunately, younger people of today think that, where we are in our society, we are the pinnacle. No one has ever reached this before. Do you know what I mean? This is all new. This is, nobody's ever done celebrity chef or master chef or pop stars, or it's like, this is our thing. This is the Western world's thing. It's not. It's and how many did you say? 15, maybe, civilizations. It's like, well, how many times does this need to happen for us to go, okay, we see the pattern, we're on track with this pattern, maybe we need to pull back, but they never do, because unfortunately the people that are in power are firmly on those railway tracks, and they're heading straight for that wall, and they can't see it.
Yeah, look, I agree with you broadly. I also think that this affects everybody, actually.
I know.
And when we reach these points of decadence, I think they sap the sort of lifeblood of entire societies. So I know a lot of young people today, unfortunately, who are very unenthusiastic about their future prospects. Sometimes it's hard to watch. And I think that's, looking really broadly, personally, it's actually tragic, I think. But looking broadly, that's not that surprising, because I think as a society, as a civilization, we've kind of run out of puff. We've run out of enthusiasm. We don't have any sort of overlying sort of unifying belief systems or ideals or principles or anything like this at all. As we've kind of run out of puff. And as you point out, obsessions with really non-essential human activities, let's say, like pop singers and celebrity chefs or whatever.
Yeah.
This is actually timeless, like, as I said, Glubb brings it up from the Persian Empire, but you could pretty much, the latter days of Rome, I'm sure in some regards look pretty similar,
Well, Caligula, Rome.
It's very,
yeah,
very hard to see this as not something that's been laid out, because the whole notion of the voyeur has become massive with internet culture.
Oh, yeah.
And, people like Marshall McLuhan was screaming at us that this notion of connectivity will work against us, but because we'll get caught up in the minute minutiae of people's personal lives, and we'll do what you're telling us to do, we will miss that bigger picture.
Yeah.
And what Glubb is saying, what David's saying, is pull back, people, look at it as a whole, and take that time to stop and smell the roses. Because if you actually slow down this whole impact, this tsunami of data and information, and turn around and look at the most important things in the world, and I'm frightened for the youth of the world, but I'm also very excited, because I know a lot of young people that are actually taking advantage in the best way possible, creatively, what's at their fingertips. And it wasn't at my fingertips. The most breakthrough piece of equipment we had was a cassette recorder, and all of a sudden we could start mailing our music overseas and feel like we were part of a larger community. Now you can do the whole lot without being tied to a corporation that's going to manipulate and corrupt your creativity.
But that's always been a small amount of people, and you are, because you were one of those people back then, you are still plugged into those kind of people today.
And they're in abundance.
The majority of younger people, unfortunately, especially I know in Australia, and why they say it's like, I'm like, how can people afford to go out every day and eat out and drink when most of their income goes on, all that, instead of how they're going to save for a house? And so, well, why would they want to save for a house when they can't, because they know it's beyond? So they say, what the hell, we'll just rent and we'll just use our disposable income on going out and having a good time, and who cares what the future holds?
I think the biggest problem too, and we're going to stop doing this because we're here to interview David, not ourselves. But what I think the biggest problem is that the youth of today have been hit psychologically far more extremely than we have.
Yeah.
And they're literally living through another 1960s. They're living through a Cold War. They're living through a hot war. They're living through a multiplicity of space races. They're being bombarded with information overload like you've never seen.
Yeah.
And they've gone through the last few years where their basic mortality has come into question.
Yeah,
I think they're all good points, and I have to add, I think on some level, so much of this stuff is deliberate. I think this is all on some level we're witnessing psychological warfare play out, and this does, in fact, I think, tie back into the Kennedy assassination. I would propose that on a larger scale, that is a mass kind of psychological warfare ritual, basically sort of an occult ritual on one level. I think it's also, of course, pragmatic. We want to get rid of this guy, he's a thorn in our side, whatever. I understand all that, but I do think there's also a higher level where this is some sort of occult ritual to damage and demoralize the population. I would argue very strongly that 9/11 is the same. And I would argue, and of course, there are multiple levels happening in all these things, because they're highly designed operations. I would also argue that the last couple of years, I'm not going to say any of those words that you've told me we're not allowed to say, but I'm going to say the last couple of years is also an incredibly coordinated and resourced
huge reset.
Psychological
it's like a grimoire.
Yeah.
It's like a spell's been cast over us.
Yeah.
And the symbols that are being used. I mean, and the signs and the symbols are everywhere.
Yeah.
Let's not step too deeply into the darkness, because I want to get you back very soon to discuss the alien invasion, the takeover that is basically AI. And you did a great lecture for us quite a few years ago, pulling up Philip K. Dick and people like that. And I think none of us realize at this point just how much AI is going to affect our lives. And my reaction to AI was, get me a pad and a paper now and a pencil now. I'm never going to use that. But we're all going to eventually end up using it for one purpose or another. And I believe it's already done extraordinary things in archival work, in finding lost films and lost data. And that is remarkable.
Here's the thing. These are amazing tools. You know, technology is an amazing tool. It just depends how it's used. And when it's been given to, you know, some people that it shouldn't be given to children. Let's just say that, because their brains are not fully formed.
And you can see how effective it is.
And you can see that some people have addicted personalities. And once they get those phones,
most of us do,
and, you know, those social media, they become, you know, entrapped in there, and it takes over their lives, and then they become a slave to it, you know. I have no problem with technology, but you've got to be pretty strong to be able to stay on top of it and not let it, you know, rule you. You've got to be able to rule it and use it, you know, as a tool, not becoming a slave to it. And unfortunately, that's what happens. We become slaves to it.
But isn't AI letting the genie out of the bottle? Let's
I don't
let
know.
David.
I don't know. Well, we'll need to discuss that.
With all respect, I'm going to slightly disagree with you.
That's okay. You're allowed to. Just because you're wrong doesn't mean
I know. I'm going to do the best I can with being wrong. I do think, for starters, actually technology is kind of problematic. I'm a bit of a Luddite at the core. Yes, I use technology, of course, but I struggle with our relationship with technology, because I feel there's something about human nature where we're not equipped to deal with technology. In that that talk that I gave for your group that time a few years back, whatever that was, I did raise my theory, which I still theorize, and that is technology possibly some kind of other life form? You know, if we're carbon-based life forms, I do wonder, it's just a hypothesis, but I do wonder if what we're saying is some sort of attack or invasion from another life form, and that is what we think of as technology, a potentially silicon-based life form, but it sort of behaves a bit like a life form, you know, because life forms in the largest scale, in the most abstract scale, they use resources, they propagate themselves, they claim territory. These are all things that organisms do, and this is also what I would argue we are witnessing technology do at the moment.
Sure.
I
don't think that's disagreeing with us.
No.
I mean, I'm totally with you. If it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, what have we got? And it's beginning to do that.
These are just basic questions that I have. I'm not saying I have the answers necessarily, but I am asking that question about technology because it does, in the larger, more abstract way, behave like a life form. And I would also argue that while it's definitely part of the zeitgeist to doomsay about the encroachment of AI and all these technologies, and this moment of that we're worried about, many of us, of transhumanism arriving. I actually think it's already here. And I think if you, and I unfortunately have witnessed this many times, if you look around, okay, so I'm a bit of a Luddite. I choose not to have a cell phone, a mobile phone. But when I look around, we were in a cafe the other day, right, to give you a tangible example. And there was, 20, 30 people in this cafe. It was full. And I looked around and there was this fair sprinkling of couples. Maybe there was 8, 10 couples, and then a few people who were solo. Everybody in that cafe, including the couples and the solos, everybody was staring the entire time that we were in there at their phones. you know, and I noticed, and this particularly struck me, okay, and you'll probably accuse me of being old-fashioned here, which is fine, I can handle it. Even couples who are meant to have some sort of romantic or some sort of engagement of some kind, there was zero conversation happening. Yeah. Everybody was staring at their phones, and it really struck me. I thought, oh, transhumanism's here. It's already here.
I know, I see that all the time. And you know what? I you know, my niece bought us a mobile phone last year when we moved to this place, because we actually didn't have a phone or connectivity for like a month. So we were like right off the grid. And she went and bought me this crappy little phone. And, you know, she gave it to us. Now, I take it with me in the car when I'm traveling to my son's place. Most of the time I still forget to take it with me, right? I don't take it with us. If I do take it with us, it stays in the car. And it's just for driving. And, you know, the other night I actually did need it because I was on my way home late at night. I'd been to a meeting, so I didn't leave till after 9. And I, halfway into driving, I stopped at these lights, and then I didn't move for 45 minutes. I was sitting in the traffic. There'd been some horrific accident the next set of lights over, and after 45 minutes, finally the police got there, and they started to tell us to go left. So I was right there at that, and they said, go left. Now, I didn't know that suburb at all. I had no clue where I was, and I did have the phone with me, so I punched in my home address on Google Maps, and it showed me how to get home. And that was like a godsend, because I eventually would have found my way home, of course, because I can read signs, but it would have taken me twice as long. And I was able to ring Jamie and tell him that I was caught in the traffic, so he wouldn't be freaked out and worried about me. And I thought that was a great, you know, use for a tool. But that's it. I mean, if I'm at home, it pings all the time and it pongs and stuff like I never go and look at it. You know, people days later saying, you know, they will ring me at home and say, don't you get my messages? And I'm like, no, if I'm at home, I use my landline. Ring me at home. And if I'm on the road, well, I won't ring you unless it's really, really important. So I do use those. And that's the thing. It's like, again, you know, if I'm sitting in a coffee shop with Jamie, there's no way I'd be sitting and looking on a phone. I do that stuff, browsing on, you know, if I'm looking for stuff on a computer, I do that at home in the privacy.
If you're born into that world, that's going to happen. I think the biggest thing is it's changing our neurological chemistry.
The children are being changed.
It's changing our attention span. It's changing our visual acuity on environment and landscape. It's altering us, and that worries me.
Yeah, I think it should. I mean, I think, look, it's somewhat a generational thing. I think if you're under 30, as Jamie's pointing out, you don't know anything else. You don't have any other, you know, sort of historical
system
options
to live under. Yeah,
you know. So, I mean, I do think, you know, because I think it's important. We have to engage with reality, and we have to engage with the truth. I think that's incredibly important. Transhumanism's here. Like, if you're think about it, if a device like that is like a kind of a fog, you know, and so if people get all their information and all their sensory input from a device, this is transhumanism.
And a device that is actually honed into trying to make them purchase things all the time, because that's what they're about.
But the other thing is the amount of stress. And I noticed we've got a few people that, because of where we've moved to now, we're very aware of their behavior, and they're on the spectrum. And the pinging of that phone just adds more and more to their anxiety and their submissive ability to start to respond to those purchases, because it will alleviate that stress for a small amount of time. I think what we're looking at is the psychology that was invested into gambling, poker machines.
Mhm.
All that same psychology is coming into play on a massive worldwide scale.
Absolutely.
But David, we have to thank you so much for your time. And I'm really going to have to go out there and find some organic drug to allay that fever pitch in my wife, because we're here to interview you and not you for taking up the entire half of the
we're
podcast.
here to discuss something.
No, I love it. And we can't wait to see you in
My
Sydney.
pleasure, guys.
But we will, within the next month, we will get you back, because I think you did a brilliant lecture for us.
It was great.
And I want to look at this notion as the algorithm being the ultimate alien invader.
Well, because it's been about 3 years, maybe 4 years since you did that
Lecture for us.
lecture, maybe even 5 now.
I think it might be a little
David?
bit more, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I
Yeah.
mean, in that time, technology has gone leaps and bounds again, of course. So we are further down the track with more, who knows what's come to fruition now.
Well, and I think, guys, there's a lot to be learned from science fiction. I mean, there really is from all sorts of levels.
Yeah,
So the present era really reminds me of Invasion of the Body Snatchers in a few different ways. I do think while we're distracted, we're looking at all these particular things and scandals and issues and outrages and blah 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 and this and
they
that.
really have nothing to do with us. They don't. None of this stuff really impacts us.
I agree.
personally.
And what we're missing is the thing right in front of us, and that is our relationship with technology. Sometimes I wonder, right? For example, I wonder about the internet, because on some levels it's highly curated and censored and controlled and all that sort of stuff, and I understand that. But I also do think that when you try and look objectively at the internet will provide you any ideology that you want to choose. It'll provide you any information stream, any point of view, any perspective that you want. It will give it to you, okay, as long as you stay there. And I think this is sort of built into the architecture of it. As long as you're dealing with that technology, it will provide you with whatever you want. Okay, whatever niche interest you have, or non-mainstream political discourse, or whatever, it doesn't matter. Or the history of icing donuts, or whatever it might be. It doesn't matter. Yeah, it's all there, and I would argue on a higher level, I don't think the powers that be, the forces of darkness, I would suggest, they don't care what you think. They don't care about your political opinions or your principles or whatever, or your philosophy. It doesn't matter as long as you're engaged with technology, because then they've got you.
Yeah.
And I think there's also been these memes out there in the last decade at least, where people have become highly suspicious of their technology, and it seems to be capturing their thought forms and regurgitating them on the screen to them. And all of us have had those moments going, did that phone just hear me? Because I just got something on my news feed. And I think we're wandering into this abyss of anomalous electrical behavior that's keying into the heart of our psychological disorders. But that's a whole existential nightmare for another program. Yeah. And David, we truly appreciate your time. We appreciate who you are as someone who always inspires us creatively. You seem to be always piercing the heart of that disorder, and also doing it in such a marvelously stylistic way. We suggest that people should go up on YouTube and look for Black Lung Clips, look for Black Lung Records, look for Snog Records, and go to that incredible site we'll put a link to on the recordings. It's a magnificent label. It's truly egalitarian. Yeah. So many obscure artists that would never seen the light of day again have gone out there and are celebrated on vinyl and digital releases by David. And I think one way to stay afloat is to just dive into that positive creativity and that love you have for your family. You've got a huge brood out there on an old Common Co ranch, living in the middle of the wilderness, a hidden structure in that area of Victoria, and I'm glad you've got it.
Well, thank you, guys. It's my absolute pleasure. Look, I would also mention that we've got a relatively new show called the Forbidden Book Club, which you can find on YouTube. If people want to have a look at that, that's there. That's me and us and my cohorts diving deeply into forgotten, obscure, or marginalized books, which may be of interest to people. And it's always a pleasure, guys. And I look forward to seeing you again as soon as humanly possible.
Absolutely.
Well,
Absolutely.
books, we will actually put a link up to that cast. The name of that cast? The Forbidden Book Club.
The Forbidden Book Club, yes.
Yeah. Look, I think books and records and music are powerful tools that take us into a parallel world, another dimension that can critique the reality we're in and give us ammunition to fight and survive through it. And as you said about pop culture has truly been the unconscious dumping ground of humanity's ability to predict the future. I mean, Wernher von Braun wrote Flight to Mars in 1956, where he stated that the only way we'll ever get to Mars is by an independent entrepreneur, and let's just fancily call him Elon. This was 1956. So something is in here that comes out and tells us all the time what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Pay attention to it.
Predictive
in your
culture.
pop
Love it. Anyway.
All right.
Good.
We love you, David.
Look, all I would say in closing is that the universe is an incredibly mysterious place.
Absolutely.
You know, and we're just skating on the surface. There's so much more.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. That's true.
So
That is true.
embrace the universe and maybe steer clear of power, because all power corrupts.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
And my heart is with you, David, you and that beautiful family of yours. And we will catch up in a couple of weeks' time. And thank you to all our Untold Radio listeners, subscribers, and people that might have just accidentally popped a chorus. That gentleman on the screen there is not another brick in the wall.
No, it's not. It's not Pink Floyd.
So this is my background in honor of Roger Waters.
All right, you take good care, David. We'll catch up with you, and all the best. And we'll be back real soon with in another week with another episode of Down South Anomalies
again for sure.
My pleasure, guys.
All right, kids. See you. Thank you, David. Bye, everyone.